Hello, David and Nancy, and welcome to the exhibit called The Flying Ace at the Cade Museum in Gainesville, Florida.
This is wonderful.
So we start out the exhibit by basically very simply explaining the development of motion pictures and also the development of the idea of motion pictures as entertainment, from just snippets of a person dancing or of a prize fight or something like that. They developed into storytelling. So that's a background for the people that are coming here. Then we talk about Jacksonville, Florida as the winter film capital of the world between 1907 and 1917. And as you are aware, about 300 films were made in Jacksonville during that period. And about 30 companies, separate companies, actually made films in Jacksonville during that period, as well as in St. Augustine. That is a photoplay magazine there that shows some of the scenes in Jacksonville and St. Augustine that were used in the making of these motion pictures.
So that was an advertisement, the Photoplay magazine?
Oh no, this was an article.
An article, oh, okay.
So it talked about how Jacksonville was vying with Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the verbiage is things like, we don't want to insult people from Los Angeles, but this is also happening in Jacksonville. Unfortunately, Los Angeles did win out,
Yeah,
as you know.
eventually, yeah.
Yes. I think the reasons are complex and largely have to do with in Jacksonville, the city was less than enchanted with the movie industry. Mm-hmm. And in Los Angeles, they were able to, once it started to accelerate, in other words, the people came and came and came, then you have a center and everyone goes to the same place.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In fact, they largely came from New York. Now, why Jacksonville? First of all, there was a need to film in an area that was warm in the winter. The film industry basically started in New York and New Jersey, and to a certain extent in Chicago, all of which places are not known for their temperate climates. And so they needed a place that would be available during the winter months. Jacksonville was on the railroad line from on the East Coast. It was also largely rebuilt after the Great Fire in 1901, so there were nice hotels, there were locales where they could film. And so that's why Jacksonville, for this very brief period, became the winter film capital of the United States. The first company was the Cade Company, and this was actually the first locale of movies in Jacksonville, the Roseland Hotel. And then we go more specifically to Eagle Film City. So one of the film companies that came to Jacksonville was Eagle Film Manufacturing Company, which actually came from Chicago. And they were determined in 1916 to do a full studio complex. So a place where you would film the actual film, where you would process the film, where you would edit the film, where you would do everything. As opposed to previously, one of the problems had been that you had to send the film stock back to be developed and edited back to New York, so awkward. And they felt there was a business opportunity because other film companies that were there could actually use their services for the development of the film and the other services. So they took what was an old cigar factory and made that into their production building, and then they built 4 other buildings on the property. And we'll be talking about those buildings as we talk about the evolution of this studios. Here is the so-called set building and the water feature. And again, the photoplay article that I previously talked about the fact that Eagle had done this and was going to be a major company. They were going to make several films. Unfortunately, none of that panned out. There are some films left that can be viewed from Eagle Film Studios. And one of the things that is interesting, Marcel Perez was their major comic, and one of the films has a picture of this, you can tell, And so it's definitely filmed on the property. This picture I love because it is Marcel Perez, and they all have on their vehicles Jacksonville, Florida license plates.
Oh, a little bit of advertising, huh?
Yes. Okay, so as is noted here, probably their tenure there lasted only a couple of years. And so here was this property sitting there, not used, and enter Richard Norman. And of course, you would know much about him. And we talked very briefly here about who he was, where he was from Middleburg, Florida, growing up in Jacksonville, and that he was an inventor from a very early age. Pasicola was one of his inventions, and that he developed primarily in his motion picture activity, which started about 1912. He developed what were called townies, or local talent pictures, or local pictures, or local films. There are a lot of different names for them. But what they were was a standard script. You would go into the town, and not only was it a standard script, but there were standard publicity materials. So for example, this is what was called a U.S. Herald in those days, which was a brochure, and I have some examples of it over here. A brochure that people received, like if you went to the movies one night, they would give you this coming attraction sort of thing. So this was actually standardized, so he always had for his The Wrecker, which was his major home talent movie, he'd have the two sweethearts, the father, the wedding, and the board of directors, and these were all then filled in with local people. So the local people took the parts in his town movies. Sleepy Sam the Sleuth was another town movie that he did. And as you probably know, you can actually see a little bit of that on YouTube. There's a little bit of that left. We have not found The Wrecker, even though it was made at numerous cities in the South and the Midwest. Here, it was the Lyric Theater. Unfortunately, the Lyric Theater does not exist anymore in Gainesville, Florida. It is it was in a building that's right next to the Hippodrome Theater now.
Oh, really?
So I can actually show you where it is, or where it was.
Yeah.
And these were, you really got your money's worth when you went to one of these, because you would have a feature film, you would have a newsreel, you would have a cartoon, and you would have this movie. For 12 cents for adults and 5 cents for children, or that ilk.
So Barbara, one of the things I remember from my dad telling me was that my grandfather would, after the movie was over, The Wrecker, since it was a standard script, he would either give it to the theater or some prominent official in town. And so that's why he didn't hold on to the films. But if we're lucky, in one of the 50, 60 places he showed this film, you may find one in a dungeon somewhere. The other thing that you probably know is interesting was when my grandfather showed The Wrecker, when he developed the town people to help out up in Marinette, Wisconsin. That's where he met my grandmother. And I actually have one of the playbills like this one from the record that shows her in the wedding scene.
Now
and so
that's fascinating.
That's when he came to her and says, "How would you like to be in movies?" Of course, she said yes.
And an interesting tidbit about the Gainesville one is that Rex Ferrier, who apparently was friends with the Lyric Theater owner, was a football star at the University of Florida. And there's actually a Ferrier Hall at the University of Florida, because he was a very prominent and early football star there, as well as eventually becoming president of the Florida Bar and a few other things. So now we're going to talk about Richard Norman and what were called at that time, and still are called, race films. And these came about as a result of the fact that the prevailing stereotypes that were shown in films of African Americans were, let's say, not very favorable. And there was a very large push among African Americans and others to show films that showed African Americans in a much more realistic, positive light. That was particularly true after the release of The Birth of a Nation, which was particularly racist. What Norman did was to take the record that he'd been using so successfully. Here we have a romance, a large-scale train wreck, the devil trying to influence actions of the bad guy. We have a classic story, so he rewrote it to be, and he'd actually used this title before, The Green-Eyed Monster, because obviously from the title, it was about jealousy. It was about two men who were actually fighting over the same woman. He expanded it with other materials, and it came out as The Green-Eyed Monster with an all African American cast. And I have actually quoted here from his press book, because this, I think, states the purpose of his race films. The lawyer, doctor, banker, and finished actor and actress portray this story, which in a subtle way suggests the advancement of the colored race along educational and financial lines. There is not a white man in the cast, or is there depicted in the entire picture anything of the usual mimicry of the Negro. This photoplay has been endorsed by the most prominent colored people of America. And of course, that's using the language of that time. But it shows the purpose and why this particular film was incredibly popular. And so because of its popularity, he decided to continue to make this type of film. About the same time that he made this film, he moved back to Jacksonville. He had been located in the Midwest. He moved back to Jacksonville and began making more of the so-called race films. So the next film was The Bulldogger, which was memorable because he used Bill Pickett, who was an African-American bulldogger. In fact, he invented bulldogging. Cowboy rodeo star, so that was about him. He filmed another movie, The Crimson Skull, and those two movies were also successful. Moving then to approximately 1923, when he is working in Jacksonville, these films were actually made in Oklahoma, although he was based, his headquarters was in Jacksonville. Here we see him making something in Jacksonville called Regeneration. Unfortunately, none of these movies still exist, as far as we know. And Regeneration was about a shipwreck and a treasure, and you can guess the rest from some of the images. I'll also note here that one of the people that we see throughout his movies is Steve Pegg Reynolds, and I'll talk a little bit more about him when we talk about The Flying Ace. The primary thing that I want to show you here is these are actually the intertitle cards or the title cards from The Green-Eyed Monster and from Regeneration. Those are 100 years old.
Wow.
These are, I was talking about these U.S. Heralds. This is what they are. They're small things that were handed out to show, okay, this is what's coming up. And these are just a variety of them from Florida. This actually is fascinating because this, you cannot see it very well, but it actually has Eagle Film Company and in Jacksonville, Florida, on this canister.
I see that.
And that was found
Wow.
in the building.
Oh my.
I can imagine what would still be there if the property wasn't sold to Mr. Smith, because every nook and cranny of that building, all the building had stuff in it. I mean, I have some pictures from my grandmother's files that shows the downstairs area we're talking about stacks of papers.
I believe that he does seem to have
He doesn't
kept
seem to throw
things.
away anything.
To our benefit, no.
Yes, very, very much to our benefit. And these are just interesting memorabilia from that era. The Pathé scope, most people don't realize that Pathé, which was a French company that made a lot of movies and that distributed a considerable more, such as all the Harold Lloyd early movies, they had basically a Netflix kind of thing, where you would buy their projector and then you would order films. It was, and this is the 1920s. So that's just of interest. This is a Magic Lantern, and Richard Norman was involved with Magic Lantern production. And of course, they use Magic Lanterns all the time in theaters to advertise coming attractions. And now let's go to the Flying Ace, which is the subject of this exhibit. And thank you very much to the Jacksonville.
Oh, there's it, Nancy, that's the plane they made.
To
There's
the
a club in Jacksonville. I
Gateway
think.
Radio Controlled Flying Club of Jacksonville.
Isn't that
Thanks to
neat?
the Gateway Railroad.
That is wonderful to
Oh,
see.
wow.
And I just think it sets it all very, very
Oh, yeah.
nicely. And so this discusses the Flying Ace movie. And we know that there were at least 3 or 4 people that he could have used as models for the main character, who is a railroad detective who came back presumably from World War I as a flying ace, even though, of course, at that time, no African Americans were allowed to be flying aces in the United States Army. But there were a number of people, the most famous of which is Bessie Coleman. And Bessie Coleman is pictured there. And she, because she had seen the Bulldogger, she became interested after the initial contact was made with her, with a friend of hers. She was interested in having Norman make something similar about her life, just as he had done about Bill Pickett's life. Unfortunately, before the film could be made, she died in an accident in Jacksonville. Now, various things that, for the purposes of this exhibit, that need to be emphasized. The Flying Ace was made totally at the new studios that Richard Norman had purchased. In other words, he had purchased the Eagle Film Studios in the early 1920s. And so he made this particular film, created the stunts, which we should have the photographs of how he created some of the stunts with the airplane at the studios. And you can actually see the buildings at the studio in his movie. One of the things that I wanted to mention again was not only did we have Lawrence Kreiner, Catherine Boyd, Lawrence Kreiner actually being a prominent African-American actor who made movies in Hollywood after the silent era, so he transitioned very nicely into talkies. But we had Peg Reynolds, who was his sidekick, his mechanic in this movie, famously doing his stunt with riding a bicycle using his crutch, which is something to be seen.
Yeah, one of the things I want to mention, Barbara,
Yes.
is that if you look at some of these pictures from the set pictures, what you'll see is this building right here is actually what's called a production building. So this
Correct.
plane was sitting across what was now Arlington Road in the field or the yard at somebody's house, you might say, and you can see across into the area where the production building is. So that shows you was not only was it there, it was in the area of all his facilities, because that is a production building.
Well, you do see glimpses of the various buildings, not only the building in which you actually lived. It's one of the most prominent buildings to be shown in the film.
Yeah.
You see, again, you can see glimpses of the buildings throughout the film. I just wanted to point out the posters here. The large posters, which are 81 inches by 41 inches. There are even larger posters, as you know, that are 81 inches by 81 inches. These are of Flying Ace, and also the last film that he made, the last feature film called Black Gold, which was made a couple of years after the Flying Ace. We also have the one sheet. So we have the one sheet poster for the Flying Ace, the three sheet poster, as they were called, for the Flying Ace, the three sheet poster for Black Gold, and the one sheet poster for Black Gold. Over here we have a three sheet poster for the Crimson Stall.
Well, these are in remarkably good shape. You know, think about it, they're 100 years old.
And remarkably great graphics. The Ritchie Company actually made all of his posters. Beautiful job.
In New York.
In New York.
Yeah.
And some of the invoices and letters about that are in the collection that you have.
Oh, wonderful.
And also in the collection at the university.
Mm-hmm.
The camera phone, which you're going to be discussing. Unfortunately, this did not turn out to be the wave of the future in terms of sound when sound on film was developed. But he did sell a few of these, and he did continue certainly in the movie business. Maybe, David, you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what I've found out so far is that from about 1928 to 32, he was active in the camera phone development and also sales and service. So he actually developed the equipment and then would go out and distribute it to different theater houses and then go back and service it over time. And so about 1932, that dwindled down to, it wasn't very profitable for him. So he had to basically stop that endeavor. There's actually two parts to the camera phone that I don't think most people realize. There's the sound on the disc portion, which the disc is played on like a turntable, synchronized with the movie projector. There's also what he had, the sound on film accessory that you added to the projector to read the sound on film, which is relatively new back in the 30s. So not only could a theater purchase the camera phone with the turntable and use it if they didn't have the sound on film, but if they had sound on film, they could purchase the accessory, which went on the front of their projector, instead of buying a new projector, which were very expensive. So he was looking for unique ways to promote that market. And unfortunately, by 1932, people already switched over to sound on film.
And then our last part is what we're trying to do with the Norman Studios complex. As a result of extremely dedicated local volunteers, the building itself, the main building, the production building, and 3 of the buildings were bought by the city of Jacksonville. And the exteriors were restored, not the interiors. And the other building, the 5th building, if you will, the studio building is owned by a church that is willing to sell the property to the museum. It is now run by the Norman Studios Silent Film Museum, Incorporated.
See the etching on here, where it has the more information than just what's on the cover.